Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Launchpad's Pick and Mix podcast. And today, as you have already noticed, we have got the great Matt Stone here. And I'm going to start off by admitting there's something quite guilty. I'm such a fan that I've actually been bending his ear for about 10 minutes before we press record. So yeah, maybe I'll share that. Maybe I'll just keep it all to myself. Anyway, for regular visitors, you'll know that this is usually structured, well, always structured around a set of slides. So I'm just going to get those up and running before we get started. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Yeah, great. So Matt's here. He sent me this lovely this picture of him. I didn't know which way to put it round. I thought, do I get it facing
Love that.
him, facing
Yeah.
away? So I went with what it is. And if you don't know him, he's the Director of Education and Operations at Teaching Walkthroughs, and we'll learn a bit more about that on this next slide. Bit of fancy animation there, lovely. So Matt, tell us, what is your job?
Well, I mean, first off, Chris, that I think that photo on the previous slide is probably the single greatest photo of me ever taken. It's like that doesn't match up to reality at all. It was just like a snapshot. I love it. But listen, yeah. So my role with Walkthroughs, as director of education, is broadly built around supporting schools. So I work with schools, either directly with school leaders or with teachers or groups of teachers within schools, sometimes with system leaders as well. So people in a similar role to yourself, Chris, to implement evidence-based teaching and learning approaches, to build sustainable and realistic professional development systems, to utilize the power of coaching as a core tool for professional development, and build those systems around, as you mentioned earlier, our teaching walkthroughs toolkit, so our kind of pedagogical playbook and the resources that we kind of compiled around those, so that we can leave schools with a really clear direction in terms of how they're going to develop teachers, how they're going to improve teaching and learning over time.
Nice. And
Yeah.
I guess for people that have been, like, I don't know, on Mars or the moon, this is the walkthrough books, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's at the heart of what we do is the walkthroughs, the teacher walkthrough series. So the three books written by Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caviglioli. 106. Sorry, Chris. Yeah,
Well, no, and it's
160.
much more than that now, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's the three books, the original books, the teacher walkthroughs books, and then also the learning walkthroughs book as well, which was released just before the summer, which follows the same kind of recognizable walkthroughs format, but contains 75 approaches, techniques for students and parents to think about how they can get the best out of the learning experience as well. Being in the classroom, revising at home, as a parent or guardian, supporting your child to engage really productively in the learning process. And they've been massively popular as well.
Amazing.
Really good
Yeah, I
tool.
mean, what an incredible impact. We were talking about this offline, and I guess I'd be interested, and I'm sure the listeners are interested in what you did before that and why the move into this.
Yeah, so I'm a teacher, so I taught secondary English for nearly 16 years, just over 16 years. The last kind of 5 or 6 years as a senior leader, leading on teaching and learning, all in South Wales. And as we'll talk about later on, I mean, I absolutely loved that work. I loved being in school. I loved the work that I was fortunate enough to lead on when I was in school. This opportunity caught me by surprise. I was working with the walkthroughs materials in school. We were doing a lot of work around developing coaching systems, not just in our school, but across a region of schools in South East Wales. And I suppose that kind of caught the attention of Tom and Oliver and the work that they were doing. There was a mutually beneficial interest in working with the materials and thinking how they look, how they might look in practice, and how we might support schools to implement similar programs. And that led to a little bit of freelance work, some writing work, some resourcing, some consultancy work, and then I had this amazing offer around about 18 months ago to come and do that full time. And it was, it was just an incredible opportunity. So it was a no-brainer for me at the time. As hard as it was to leave my existing post, it was a great opportunity. It's been amazing. It's been
well, that'd be really interesting. I mean, because I guess the work's quite varied. How does a typical week look?
It is really varied. So, like last week was really quiet because all the schools were on half term. This week is not so quiet. But typically I'll spend maybe 2 or 3 days in schools leading our what we call our walkthroughs implementation programs. We've got around about 30 schools currently working on these programs where we support them to design and implement and then kind of future-proof their own systems using the walkthroughs material. Sometimes that's a one-off kind of visit, but increasingly that's part of a longer intensive program that runs over a term or 2 terms. So I do, generally it's kind of 2 or 3 days a week doing that. I'm really fortunate to do lots of speaking around professional development and coaching in particular. So, generally I'll have a day doing something like that. And then any spare time around that, I'm resourcing, writing, building the toolkit, working with members, kind of maintaining the online support that we offer, running webinars. My favorite piece of work currently is leading our coaching program, Coaching with Walkthroughs, which runs termly. I was saying just to you, Chris, before we came online, we've had now around 300 teachers come through that in a fairly short space of time. Around six or 7 cohorts of that have run. So that takes up a bit of time. So there's a lot of traveling around and doing stuff. But it's really varied, really exciting work. Yeah, really.
Well, we talked offline as I alluded to that. For me, the most exciting and the sort of the shift is the support that comes after, the additional support that's put in place post, purchasing a book, and how that aligns with everything we know about good professional development. That is sustained and it's rhythmic and it's collaborative and all that sort of stuff. So super exciting. Well, that's a bit about kind of what you do. So the rest of the the podcast for new listeners is more about kind of Matt himself. And so we have a set sort of structure to these things where we go through various different points. And Matt selected a couple of Launchpads before the session, a couple of fast friends questions, but he's also identified a couple of ignition points, so things that have happened in his life that have changed him. And so we'll get started on that and start with this first fast friends question. And he chose this one. What would constitute a perfect day? So what is that?
Listen, I found these questions so challenging. I couldn't choose which ones to select, but I went for this one because it's something that's on my mind at the moment, right? And there's a context behind this. Not so long ago, I think kind of just around COVID, things were pretty tough for lots of people, and it was like pretty tough for us. And, like many people, we'd kind of suffered a bit of family tragedy around that time, and work was pretty intense. And obviously anybody who was in a school at that time would know what the challenges were like. And I had this kind of dawning realization that there was more to life than just work. And I had to kind of find a way to spend some time with my family, with some kind of 2 young children as well. And we decided to buy a static caravan, like by the sea. Like, I've always been fascinated. I love the seaside. I love being on a beach, but just like being near the sea, having the smell of the sea in kind of in your nose and stuff. I love it. And so we bought this caravan in West Wales, and it's like the best thing I've ever done. It was like, wow. It was the most profound life change, really that you can imagine. And, part of that was because there's very limited Wi-Fi, right? So you can't, So
disconnected.
however you want to, you can't do much. So you're disconnected. But for my children, kind of growing up now, weekends, summer holidays, half-term holidays, in the sea, on the beach. There's nothing like it. So it had a really kind of transformational effect on our family life. And the only downside with it, Chris, is that the caravan season doesn't start up until March. So now I'm kind of in the winter lockdown and thinking,
chomping at the bit.
My perfect day is around the corner. So I imagine kind of spending some time on the beach with my kids, walking along kind of a coastal path, watching the sun dip down into the sea in the evening with some good food and a glass of wine.
Yes.
Maybe 9 holes of golf somewhere if I can get away.
There you go.
But that's for me. That would be, I think, right now. That's what I'm after is that kind of perfect day.
Well, I was smirking because I'm now like live my life in terms of leadership launchpads. When I'm literally like walking around the streets listening to people, and they jump into my head. And I've just scribbled down, you have to disconnect to connect.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
that's funny.
I heard you mention in one of your previous podcasts that you're planning Launchpads 2.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great one.
Constantly going.
But I really think that teaching, I know this is probably true of lots of professions, and this is probably quite a poorly informed opinion, but I think teaching and leadership in schools and education, it's so all-consuming for lots of people. It takes over. It isn't as far from a 9-to-5 kind of job as you can get. And when you are self-motivated, when you're into it, it can be really hard to disconnect, right? And I found that in school as much as I find it now, it's hard. And
really fascinating. And the other thing that struck me when you were talking about that is, I don't know if you did this by design, but potentially we need to be forced to disconnect because we probably wouldn't choose to do it otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you could talk about, we will talk about ignition moments, and, that sounds like a motivating thing, but sometimes, those moments can ignite other things, right? Other responses.
Absolutely. And all right, well, let's get cracking on then, shall we? So the next thing that we typically do in the podcast for the new listeners is we talk about an ignition point. And as I said before, some sort of event that changes a person. And so, tell us a bit about what you were like before this, what the ignition point was, and then what change happened.
Yeah, well, I hope it's okay. But the ignition point I want to talk about is something that happened over a period of time as opposed to a single moment in time, but quite a definitive moment in my professional life. So when I left university, I was a bit directionless, I think. Don't know if you've seen Avenue Q, but there's a lovely song in there about what do you do with a BA in English.
Really?
It's like, it could be tough. Like, so I had my BA in English. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was working part-time in a supermarket whilst I was in university, and they offered me a full-time route to management, and that was what I did because I didn't have any other plans. And I suppose at that point I kind of fell into this world where I was motivated by being successful with financially, and it doesn't seem the most lucrative path, but actually, people make a really good living in retail. You can,
yes, they do.
They make a really good living in retail, and that was what it was about for me. And I kind of just went down that path, and I actually did it for kind of 5 or 6 years before I got into teaching. And then I had this moment. Then I had this kind of, I was working night shifts, and I remember being kind of a bit disheartened in the middle of the night, thinking, I think I could probably do something else. And that's no disrespect. I like to people who do that, but it just wasn't for me. It wasn't like academically challenging enough. I didn't feel like I was using my skill set, and so I kind of like made a bit of a rash decision, and I just like quit my job. It's just like quit, and I was kind of, like I said, I was 25, 26 at the time, so I was adulting by that point. I had like bills and stuff, and And so it was a pretty kind of reckless thing to do, but I sat at home the next day and I thought I need to try and find something now. And I'd never wanted to be a teacher. I'd never had any intention to be a teacher. But I thought, I wonder if I could have a look at teaching.
Yeah.
And I'd missed some of the deadlines for PGCE applications. I found one not too far away from you, actually, Bristol, and applied for it and got it. And that was like such a motivating moment for me. It was like, and I felt like a bit of pressure, like you said earlier, about being forced into something. I was like, it had to work. Do you know what I mean? It was so important that it worked out, and and so that really kind of kicked me forward. That was amazing, and I was so fortunate from there to kind of get a really good job in an amazing school, the first school I worked in. One of the themes I found it really therapeutic thinking about all this, Chris. And one of the themes that came up was how important it is to be championed by other people as well, right? And I want to just shout out to Hugh Ring, who's the deputy head teacher in my first school, who kind of put a big arm around me for about 10 years. And that was such a big thing for me, securing a job in a great school with great people around me. And I threw myself into it. That was it. It was amazing. So that was a really important thing for me. Yeah.
Really cool. And I think, again, it speaks to the importance of leadership, but also the responsibility that leaders have and the power they have to change the lives of the people kind of below them. Yeah. And it doesn't even need to be that kind of sophisticated,
No.
Believing in people, praising people, putting an arm around the shoulder. I was smiling when you were talking, because there's a lot of connection between the two of us, because I, left university. What do you do with a 2-2 in PE? I mean, beat that one. And I ended up being a bit kind of like drifty, and I thought, oh, well, I'll go in. I live really close to my old secondary school. My parents did. So I thought I'll go help out at the school or do something like that. And I was sat in the PE office, because that was kind of like my spiritual home. And the deputy head, who was my old science teacher, like popped his head in. Oh, hey, Chris, chit chat. What are you doing? I thought, I'm not really sure. Oh, you ought to come and be a teacher. And I sort of laughed. And he said, no, seriously.
Yeah.
I said, right. He said, oh, I'm running this GTP, it was for like older people sort of thing.
Yeah.
He said, I'm running it. And I said, right. Oh, okay. Well, I'll have a think about it. Anyway, that was what I thought was it. He came back like 15 minutes later and said, I spoke to the head and you can train here if you want.
You're in that quick. That's amazing.
And I was like, so I kind of went home and that was it. That was my journey. So,
but that moment, and I said to you offline, I was listening back to your episode with the amazing Sam Gibbs, and it's like heartbreaking when you hear the stories that she was sharing around the toxic leadership that she'd been subjected to, and I just feel how different my experience was as a new teacher coming into the profession, and what a difference that made.
It is,
it's such an important lesson for all leaders out there, I think.
I think it is, and we talked, don't we, about the importance of quality teaching and how students can get different experiences, but it's the same for staff. We got to upskill everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to your first Launchpad. And for those that are new, again, typically these Launchpads have come from the Leadership Launchpad book that I created, and I'll do a kind of brief introduction to it about where it came from, what my thinking was, and then we'll ask Matt why it resonated with him. And so the first one that he's chosen is this idea of becoming more expert. And when I wrote about it, I was thinking about this idea that it is a kind of false dichotomy of jumping suddenly from novice to expert. It doesn't happen like that. And we should see expertise kind of more as a continuum, which not only changes it kind of incrementally, but quite dynamically sometimes. And so when I first started thinking about this idea of a continuum, I thought, maybe there's more to it. And the first thing I thought about is that it's rarely a kind of linear journey, is that you might make some initial improvements and then you stutter a little bit, and then you're in a sweet spot. And like we spoke about, that may be linked to the environment that you work in and the people you work for. I then started thinking about how often our expertise is probably reset. Like every time you get promoted, you kind of become a novice again, or you slip back a bit, don't you? You're suddenly, I was good at that job, now I've got this job, and there's some transferable elements, but that's kind of interesting. And then also I thought, wow, it probably doesn't always just go forward. You can get worse at things. And certainly if your role changes and you do less of something, then that's a natural thing. And I've talked to a few guests on a few episodes about how careful we need to be about, with the best intentions, taking responsibilities away from people, because potentially you're then eroding their expertise because they don't have time to practice it. And so a lot of my thinking from this came from Peps McRae, really, because in his book, one of his books, he talks about kind of, there are other things that I guess people would demonstrate if they were experts. And I thought this is really fascinating. And so he talks a lot about this idea of perception, in that experts just see things differently, or as we're talking about now, people with more expertise, they, in any given environment, they are attending to different information. We see this a lot, don't we, with trainee teachers. If you send a trainee teacher to watch a lesson in their first day or two, they're watching, but they're not picking up on the things that the established teacher sat next to them is, Perhaps talks a bit about execution, which is probably a more obvious one, that we just seem to select more effective actions and they're done with a bit more accuracy and fluency. I think this one's fascinating. And he talks about this idea that the more expertise you have, the more able you are to anticipate situations because of probably acquired expertise. When you come across a challenge and you try something and it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, that's great as well, because this all goes into the memory bank. And when I think about this, the maths of it must be bonkers about how many simulations teachers are running in their minds
100%.
at any given point about, if I do this, the last time I tried that happened, so I might do this, just constantly, subliminally, just stinging, refining all the time. And then, as we know, a lot of people that are really good at something have done it so often that they're able to almost push it to the back of their minds. They have this conservation where they work largely on autopilot. And again, we see that in teachers, don't we? You sort of, again, go back to the trainee teacher thing, like, oh my, you're so amazing. You make it look so effortless. And it's like, it's taken me 20 years to get to this point.
Absolutely that,
It wasn't always that way. So why did this one resonate with you?
Listen, for lots and lots of reasons, right? So firstly, the false dichotomy piece at the start, I think I've for a long time been really uncomfortable with the idea of, particularly in education, and I'm talking really through the lens of teacher development here. Like, I think it's really unhelpful to have this expert novice teacher mentality. In my work, I see lots of schools go down this route, and it rarely ends well, particularly if there's a perception that the coach or the leader is the expert teacher and the teacher who is being supported is de facto the novice. It's like, it's really confrontational language and doesn't necessarily form a good platform for what we talk a lot about, the co-construction, the kind of that partnership of coaching, and I really love the point that you made earlier around the fact that there are so many different things that affect expertise in different pockets. And I think it was Josh Goodrich a few years ago, I remember watching on a research ed kind of video session and talking about what we think expertise looks like. We think that expert teachers have just got this full up bar of expertise.
Yeah.
And then a novice has just got all these empty blocks. But the reality is we're all a little bit novice and a little bit expert in different contexts, right? And being humble and acknowledging that, and not assuming that just because you're in the position of coach or leader that you, A, have all the answers, or B, should be required to give the answers, I think is such an important disposition for coaches and professional development leads. So there's that thing, first of all. I think really thinking carefully about the language of expert and novice and how we use that. I think it's okay to say, I'm an expert coach, and I'm here to help you as a teacher, not because I'm an expert teacher and I could do your job better than you, but because I've got some good questions, I can, and I've got this kind of skill set that I can work with you. I think there's a slight difference there. The other thing, I mean, I'm a big fan of Peps's work around expert teaching, and actually before the book, much like yourself, Chris, I kind of I like to organize things visually and produce kind of visual guides to complex ideas because it helps me understand them better. And actually, before the book came out, Peps had written a paper called Developing Expert Teaching, and I captured that in kind of quite close detail. And I love the idea of the four kind of enabling factors there, the idea of kind of perception, simulation, execution, conservation. And really kind of when I saw this in your book, it resonated with my work now. And I currently do a lot of thinking and talking around the work of Charles Goodwin and the idea of professional vision. And this is the idea that in complex domains and specific domains and professions, the experts within those professions, as you were saying earlier, build this kind of capacity to see their environment in a very specific way that often is unrecognizable or too tacit for non-experts to see. The example I love that he talks about in his paper, Professional Vision, is around archaeology and how expert archaeologists kind of will study a sample of Earth that to anybody else just looks like a sample of Earth, and yet they can pick out individual characteristics of features that help them age it and categorize it and, and understand and learn about kind of what they're looking at. And what's really nice about this is the way that then feeds into novice archaeologists, right? It's like
of course.
They use coding schemes and markers to kind of make things obvious and point things out, because if you don't know it and you don't know what you're looking at, you can't identify it, you can't work on it, you can't address it. So this idea of kind of building professional vision and it being a co-constructed thing. So if I'm working with you, Chris, in the scenario that we spoke about, that you mentioned earlier on about maybe you're a new teacher or any teacher, we're looking at the classroom and it's like, I'm looking at different things because I've got this kind of different mental model of practice. And it's no good for me playing guess what's in my head. Did you see that? It's like my job is to guide you to it and to help you see it and to share that with you so that you understand it, so that you recognize it, so you see it. And that kind of apprenticeship happens over time in every profession.
Yeah.
And it's a really good disposition, I think, for coaching and professional development. That's what we're trying to do, because we're not always going to be there to point it out. So the next time we want to leave the teacher a better place to be able to see it themselves. So
yeah, that's so cool. I was just thinking about how that's one of the, I guess, the core things about education, isn't it? That the more, if you want to say educated you are, the more richness you can get from the world.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, go back to your, the caravan, walking along the cliffside, experts would be able to see and experience things that they would pass me by.
100%. I use that example, Chris, in one of my presentations that I made recently. I use this image of like a coastal, like a cliff face, big cliff face with the sea in the background, and on the top is a golf course, right? And it's like, when you look at this, if you know nothing about golf, right, what do you notice? Well, you notice the sea and the coast and the recognizable features. You foreground those because we see things with our knowledge, with what we know about the world, So
that's interesting.
We foreground what we know about and where the comfortable territory is. So we see the things we're looking for. Whereas if I'm a golfer and I'm less interested in coastal erosion, I'm like, God, I'd love to play that golf hole. And I'm totally sidelining and backgrounding all of this other stuff, and I'm focusing on that. And I think that's such a nice analogy for viewing the classroom. It's such a complex environment. There's so much going on. As a coach, we're in such a privileged position where even just physically, we're sat at the back of the classroom, we're seeing things differently with a much lighter cognitive load, but our job isn't to be the only person who can see that. Our job is to find ways to build that kind of perception capacity in the teacher to help them see that.
Yeah, it's like, here, have a look through these glasses.
Exactly.
You know,
Yes, exactly
have
that.
a look.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have to give you some sort of royalties for volume 2 because I just got another one. You
Yeah.
know,
Well,
we see
thanks.
things through our knowledge. I mean, that's
Yeah, I
gold.
probably haven't worded that as well as I could, but
Oh,
it's absolutely
great.
true. It's like the kind of the way in which we see the world
Yeah.
is so intrinsically attached to our understanding of it and what we're looking for. You know, in the same way students connect new information to prior knowledge, to existing knowledge, you know, we do the same. And it's just really acknowledging that and thinking about that in our work with teachers.
Well, let's keep pushing on then, and let's have a look at this next fast friends question. So, for the second one, you chose this one. Is there something that you've dreamed of doing for a long time, and why haven't you done it yet?
Oh, I can't even remember I put that question.
This happened.
That's not on my list in front of me. No,
Well,
no, I
you're on
think
your spot now.
yeah, well, there is actually, um, and yeah, and I think you might be able to help with this, which is probably why I put it in there. It's like I really want to, I want to study again. You know, I kind of like. I think it's so easy to make excuses around why you don't do this. And I study informally. I read a lot and I kind of research a lot. But I'd like to really kind of do some formal study again. Maybe do a PhD. Maybe kind of specialize in something. And that's something that I've talked about a lot for a long time, and I've never done it. And I think it's easy to point out kind of financial implications. It's hard to kind of do it. But I also think life is so busy. Reality gets in the way that, you know, the idea of committing to something like that is challenging. But so I mean, let me ask you, Chris, how did you find the time to kind of
This is the thing. I had
PhD?
all of the barriers that you're talking about, but I also had the I'm not smart barrier. I did terribly in my GCSEs, terribly. I mean, the running joke is I got a 2-2 and I didn't play sport, drink, or have a job. So I don't really know how I managed that, to be honest. So a pretty kind of, you know, unstellar thing. And I had all those problems. And I just remember, I said to someone recently today that I've got another, what my son would call a real book coming out in July about self-efficacy, because that's what my doctorate was on.
Yeah.
And over time, I've learned that kind of when I look outside my kind of what I would call a self-efficacy circle and try things, if they go well, that builds a bit more. I can reach a little bit further out and a little bit further out. And I think I must have had a string of academic things that went well, which gave me enough confidence to just press the button and apply. But even then I was paralyzed by fear at the beginning because I did mine part-time. And so the first bit of it is kind of talked. And I, again, remember vividly being in the talk sessions and people would introduce themselves and, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm a senior lecturer, I'm this, I'm that, and that, and this. And I was just like, and they'd have discussions and I remember having like comments like coming right up and I thought, well, say it. You know,
And not doing it. Yeah.
Could you imagine the embarrassment if they all looked and laughed or something? And I just think on one day I just blurted something out. And in my mind, the most intelligent guy then said, "Oh, God, that's exactly." Oh, and he was basically praising me. And after that, I was so puffed up. I was like, I mean, slowing me up. They couldn't shut me up after that.
That's so important, isn't it? Like I heard one of your other guests talk about kind of imposter syndrome and stuff, and I think that's such a real thing. Like
it really is
in so many different contexts and walks of life, in so many different scenarios. It's like what you've described there is perfect, and
it's paralyzing. Amazing. Well, let's have a look at your next kind of ignition point then. So tell us a bit about what this one was.
So again, this is like a period of time rather than an individual point. And I think I tried to give this a pithy title, really, like kind of called "Finding My Place" or "My Place in the Team." And this is kind of fairly recent. So this is kind of in the last five or 6 years. The final kind of configuration of the senior leadership team that I was a part of. And I'd been in senior leadership for about 3 or 4 years prior to that, and middle leadership for a long time. And I think initially, like many senior leaders probably would report, it's like it could be quite lonely making a step up from middle leadership to senior leadership. you come from something that is inherently team based, around a department or a faculty, and then suddenly you're responsible for your own portfolio, and you're part of a team, but can sometimes feel like your ship's in the night. It's like, it can be quite a lonely thing. And I'm finding your place in that, particularly as a new senior leader, I felt was difficult. And I had some supportive colleagues, but initially I joined quite a large, convoluted SLT. Didn't really know what my place was. I didn't really know what I was responsible for or what I had, decision-making power over, what I could really influence. I just felt like I was kind of going through the motions a little bit. And it was something as simple as we had a change in leadership. For all the right reasons, nothing kind of negative going on, but a new head teacher came in, Neris Davis, still the head teacher at Healthy now, and she was just phenomenal. Just like, I know it's easy to say, but just totally changed my perspective on being a leader and how to lead and how to manage a team, and how to put a team together, how to build something. It was just like a masterclass. And before we knew it, we had this very small, close-knit SLT, but everybody, it was only 4 of us, but everybody was in their slot, Chris. That was the thing. Everybody was in their slot. And for me, it was like that kind of what I saw as the holy grail, was like professional learning, teaching and learning, And then my colleague Adam was kind of so good, kind of one of the best person I've ever seen working in kind of pastoral care and things like that. And that was his niche. And Grant was, knew the curriculum inside out and assessment. Particularly a difficult time in Wales where curriculum reform was on everybody's agenda. It was a really difficult time, and do you know, it was the first time in my career where I could look around and I thought, not just the boss, but everybody on this team has got my back. Everybody on my team is championing me as the decision maker on teaching and learning. If I said, like, this is what I think we should do because I've read X, Y, and Z, and I've tried this and I planned this, it wasn't like, oh, I'm not sure about that. It was like, let's go for it. And it was just like so empowering. And that was reciprocated in everybody's different area, not in a kind of, not in the sense that it lacked challenge. It was rigorous and it was, really robust, but it was just like, I don't know how well I'm explaining it, but just knowing that you are absolutely trusted in that position, that you had your place and it was yours. That's such an empowering moment in professionally. And what it does, and I mentioned earlier the power of championing people earlier on, it fires you up, and I think what followed was probably the most productive and successful part of my in-school career, because I would have walked through fire for those people, and to get it right. And I knew that they were doing their bit, so I had to do my bit. And it was just such an amazing scenario. And, I didn't have to, but I walked away from that for this role. It was really tough to do, but I look back on it as one of the most kind of rewarding and motivating periods of my in-school career, definitely.
And the bit that resonated me really strongly where you're talking then is about this idea of consciously creating a team.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important thing. And one of the Launchpads is called Spiky Leaders, Rounded Teams.
Yeah.
And this idea that, we shouldn't really be trying to round people off. The idea that you were teaching and learning and, the other guy was behavior and curriculum, and you put together spiky individuals, and the complementariness of the skill set creates a rounded team, which is great. And also I love that fire analogy, this idea of, for people that are listening, have a look at the different people in your team and, just do a little kind of reflection on how ablaze, is their flame, and why not, if not, and maybe ask them and find some ways to get it stirred up. Because if you can figuratively set people on fire, like you said, the productivity goes through the roof.
I couldn't agree any more with that. That's spot on for me. And it's finding that, and it's, keeping that fire going, and it does, it's a bit of a pun with the ignition. It does,
Yeah.
it ignites across the school, right? So
Yes.
what it does is it breeds confidence from everybody. People kind of look at that kind of stability and leadership, but they look at the energy, the motivation, and they respond to it. And that is, I'm really pleased you kind of picked that up. That's a really skillful leadership attribute, is to
Yes.
craft that team, to build it like that, to make it happen. And so that for me is such an important point. Yeah, such an important idea.
Wicked. Well, the second kind of launchpad we're going to talk about is something which almost speaks to why these launchpads get created, in that I think I understand something, and then I read about it, and then I realize I don't understand as much as I thought I did, and there's a lot more to it.
And I'm not sure I really understand this one, but I've chosen it.
We'll be learning together. But when I sort of thought of this, I was thinking, I think my view of innovation before was just do more stuff, do new stuff. That's as simple as it is. That's what innovation means. And then I tripped over different types of innovation. So I was like, okay, incremental, right? Yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? And then there was this sort of step up to disruptive kind of innovation, where it wasn't just about improving existing things, it was almost creating new things. And then finally, in the kind of, I guess, the stuff I was reading, they talked about radical kind of innovation, which creates a completely new kind of market. And I think when I was reflecting on just those three, I thought, I think I'm probably stuck in the middle, or maybe the ones on the far right. I think I might have had a blind spot around just improving some of the stuff that's already there.
Yeah,
I think as leaders, we tend to get sucked into new. And you only have to speak to any member of staff and they'll say, oh, it's new again. Every year there's new this, there's new that. And I think we have to probably pull ourselves back a little bit from that. It gets a bit more in depth, because I started then reading about this thing Doblin wrote about, these 10 opportunities, which, none of this stuff is based in education. So you've got to do a little bit of the hard work to apply it. But he suggests that kind of when you're changing stuff, you can change 3 broad categories. So the configuration of something, what you offer, or the experience of your stakeholders. And he splits configuration up into, again, some non-educational stuff, or maybe not, but this idea that you could find a new way to generate income. You could build new connections, like increase your network. You could change, structures to roles and teams, or you could just look at the existing processes and find some sort of better ways. He talks a bit about kind of what you offer. So maybe it's the products that you offer, or the kind of the performance of those products. And then I think the interesting one is he talks about kind of the experience that you provide. So as a leader, I was thinking, could I innovate the levels of support? And of course, innovate might just mean tweak the way that I'm doing it. Could I tweak my communications? Could I, improve? I guess the brand is less linked, but for me, the engagement one is massive, about how can I deepen my connection with the people I lead? Because if I can do that, I think, again, I will, reap some big rewards. I mean, what were your first thoughts when you saw that one?
So I'm really interested. I'm fascinated by the idea of innovation. One of the great things that my previous head teacher offered us as a leadership team was some EQ coaching around, directed towards identifying our core values. And I'll be honest to say, it's the kind of thing that initially I was a bit skeptical about.
Yeah, a bit fluffy.
Yeah, I think so. But actually that outcome, that idea of thinking about essentially what's your North Star, what does that look like, and for me, and I've kind of held on to these, you can't see them, but they're just behind my screen now, I came up with like integrity, innovation, and drive as my core values, and I really stand by those now. I kind of feel they're on my mind when I'm working, but they're certainly when I'm kind of working with schools and when I'm coaching leaders. I think it's such an important, innovation is such an important but misunderstood idea, right? And And I'm just kind of reflecting again on the three stages along the top, like the incremental, disruptive, and radical. And I just wonder how sometimes the lines between those will blur. It's the incremental steps that lead to the disruption and the radical nature of improvement and innovation. So I think that there's that element there. There's a couple of key things that really stood out to me, right? I love the fact that you kind of it picked out the kind of more commercial side of that, the profit model. And I just want to not forget about those, but just see past those a little bit. Just think about those headings. Like for me, that configuration part is around how do we build things? Right? How do we build things that last? How do we build connections? How do we build teams? How do we build a coaching program? How do we build development opportunities? That thinking about the way in which we go about building stuff in an innovative way, that doesn't have to be more. It just means, like you said, kind of even in that incremental way, what would make this better, I think is such an important thing. The offering for me was all about like iteration. It's like, how do we make it better? And now we've built it. How do we make that better? So if I'm a leader, I've got this kind of coaching cycle in place. How do I make that better for my teachers? That might even be, I love the kind of creating complementary products. For me, that might be, how do I now massage the competing system tensions? Like, so a big one that we face is around, how do I get teachers to buy into coaching when next week they've got a performance management observation, I'm going to tell them whether they're good or not? It's like, that's a system tension that you need to find a complementary route through. And sometimes that takes innovation, right? It takes a way of thinking about it. And then the experience for me is like, how do we sustain it? How do we grow it? How do we deepen it? How do we shape our identity about it? How do we, and so all of those things kind of talk to me around, if I'm a leader in a school and I'm thinking, what's on offer? And how do I get the best out of what's on offer? How do I build the best systems and then develop them and then make them last, make them a big part of what we do? And I think the answer, the other reason, sorry to keep on, the reason I kind of selected this one was about 18 months ago, I was lucky enough to listen to Tamika Bagan, who's a head teacher in London, talking about her school improvement journey and approach. And she here's another one for your book, Chris, right? She reminded me of the work of Daniel Chambliss and the mundanity of excellence, right? The idea that, and I know excellence and innovation probably are slightly different concepts, but if we imagine that they're interchangeable for a minute and we think, what does it take to be innovative? Well, it's not about more and new and bigger and better. It's about quality over quantity. It's about doing the right small things every day, the small incremental steps. It's about building a culture of improvement. That's innovative. That's like, and that could be radical once but it takes so much time. It's not like an overnight thing, and there aren't shortcuts to this type of stuff. And I really love that. I just think this idea of reclaiming innovation as an incremental, kind of deliberate, intentional process, as opposed to this kind of lightning bolt radicalization of what's in place, I think is so important.
That's interesting. I didn't see this until you put them together, but there's a bit of a link with this one and the previous one in that potentially innovation is a continuum, that incremental leads to radical. You don't jump from one to the other, and you can't jump to radical.
Yeah, I think so.
That's interesting.
And so, for me, that was a really important one. And I think, when we work with leaders, and you must see this in your role as well, it's like when you work with schools, when you work with system leaders, school leaders, you want them to be innovative, but the whole concept of innovation is terrifying, right? Because it's so big, and it's like, and people are, anxious and nervous about being radical and disrupting. And yet the idea that you can innovate in a kind of really meaningful, intentional, deliberate, iterative way, I just think is really empowering. It should be embraced by schools, I think,
Quiet innovation.
Yeah, I think so.
Just quietly
maybe it's an extension of the kind of, it's like evolution, not revolution. It's an extension of that kind of thing, but I don't necessarily think that people always see it that way, and I think it's useful to do that.
I mean, we didn't obviously plan this, but this is exactly what I want people to get from the Launchpads, is that it's just, as the name suggests, a launchpad for further thinking. And if you can do it together in groups, is even more powerful. And so That's great. Well, we're coming towards the end now. So we've got your final Fast Friends question. And this is the one where you decided what you're going to take, and you can't say your caravan key.
No. Oh, no.
What are you going to save them from your house if it was on fire, but all your pets in your family are safe?
I was sat on the sofa with my wife choosing these questions.
Yeah.
And I said, what would you say to this? And I didn't read out the first bit. And she said, us, obviously.
Oh, of course.
So,
Yeah.
of course. Listen, I think for me, I kind of hinted it earlier, like family is a big thing to me. And, you know, everything is so digital now. And that's amazing. You know, I've got thousands of photos on my phone, but I lost my grandmother a couple of years ago, and she was the most avid, relentless, terrifying photo taker.
Right.
Like an old style kind of winding films, proper photos. And she just hoarded these albums of photos and stuff. And you know, shortly after she kind of she died, we were, I come from quite a big family, but we were delivered this kind of huge envelope that just contained hundreds of photos, and like photos of me when I was a kid, photos of my family, you know, kind of paper artifacts of a life led, like stories I'd written to my grandmother, pictures I'd drawn. And it's not necessarily, not so much from the sentimental side of it, but just like, how amazing is that, just to have this kind of, this concrete artifact.
And I love that.
That kind of tells a story of your life, to sit down with my own kids and say, have a look at this.
There you go.
And so there's a collection of those types of things, like Father's Day cards, birthday cards, you know, pictures from my own kids, the things that Chris, quite frankly, would burn in a fire and perish, and you'd never, they're not backed up anywhere. They don't exist beyond their kind of their concrete form. And so for me, I'd make a mad dash for that envelope, and make sure that came with me.
Amazing. Well, that is a great way to finish what has been a great, conversation. And again, thanks so much. I mean, people, they can connect with you on LinkedIn and obviously through the walkthrough stuff, and not to forget your, coaching case notes website. Is that still working on that?
Yeah, it's occasional. Like we're working on the coaching walkthroughs book at the moment, which is my number one writing priority. So the blogs are on hold a little bit, but yeah, there's still some, I hope, some useful blogs on there around some of the things we mentioned today: professional vision, developing meaningful teaching through great coaching, thinking deeply about building pedagogy. So yeah, I'd love for people to check that out as well.
And of course, if you've enjoyed all this stuff, the podcast's on the relevant, on the usual places. And if you want to get involved in the book, you can get it from Amazon or the QR code, and then connect with me on any of the socials. So yeah, the last thing to say is thanks for all the listeners, and I'll see you at the next one.